Well, I've said the problems with Thomas and the Magic Railroad, so what actually does work? What's the good stuff? To be honest, I know I sounded like this movie is awful, but there is actually a lot of good stuff that kinda makes up for the flaws. I'll start with the greatest thing about this movie. Diesel 10. Yep, just Diesel 10. Out of all the non-Audrey characters, Diesel 10 has got to be the most unforgettable. I mean, you cannot look at his design and tell me he'd be less memorable than P.T. Boomer, Diesel, Airy, Bert, or even Spencer. His design is over the top and unrealistic, I'll admit that, but I don't give a damn at all. He is just the perfect train villain. The one aspect I enjoyed about Diesel 10, especially in this movie, is that he's very intimidating. I mean, yeah, Diesel, Airy, and Bert were menacing and did get a few scares, but this guy is way more scary than those three combined. He's not just the dick-ass Diesel who wants to cause trouble, he's a freaking badass. But he's not just intimidating. He's also freaking hilarious. Or in this movie at least. I'm sure Keith Scott would have done perfectly with him, seeing his voice does match the character. But Neil Crone just made the character so enjoyable to watch. His interactions with Splatter and Dodge are so funny. My favorite part is where he tells them how to stop being stupid but gets covered in coal. The Pinchy thing always cracks me up, and in fact my dad used to always call him Diesel Pinchy rather than his actual name. Diesel 10 is a perfectly balanced villain for a kid's film. He's threatening, but never to the point where he really scares the audience. Well, okay, mostly. That scene where he dangles Mr. Conductor over a viaduct was a bit too intense, but I guess it doesn't really matter considering Mr. Conductor survived being flung over a mile into the windmill. However, he's also comedic. He's a fun villain who is enjoyable to watch. It's a shame he's been mellowed down in the newer specials. Splatter and Dodge are also pretty funny. They're like Bill and Ben after having an engine reassignment surgery that went totally wrong. I wish we saw more of them because they were fun to watch. Another thing that went well with the movie was the voice actors, or at least most of them. While the actors of James and Percy did not fit, and Thomas's voice sounded really annoying, the others fit the characters perfectly. Toby has his true brave personality and does not sound like a wimp at all. Gordon sounds arrogant, with his hilarious English accent, and Henry's voice really fits him. James and Percy should have stayed with Michelangelos. Well, okay, Percy I can understand, because he's supposed to be the squeaky guy. But James? I mean, he does have a high voice, but he's not Michael Jackson for God's sake. Why do you need to have a woman voice him? Michelangelos did his voice so perfectly. Stuff and nonsense! God, that was so funny. So they should have kept it. Or, you know who would have done great for James? Eric Idle. His cockney, loud voice is just perfect for him. And hell, John Cleese could also be there as Gordon. That would be hilarious. Like I said before, Neil Crone as Diesel 10 is just great, especially his laugh. Oh my god, that laugh is so creepy, but brilliant. And it's not just the voice actors who are good. While the majority of the human characters are pretty lifeless, the two who did really well were Alec Baldwin and Michael E. Rogers. Baldwin is generally a serious actor, but here, he just goes brilliantly with it. He's so full of energy. Heck, he's got more energy than he did in the actual TV series. I don't even need to go on about Michael E. Rogers. He's just hilarious. His personality, his accent, everything. It's a shame the actor isn't a big actor because he does have a lot of talent. Speaking of talent, I was surprised to learn that the music wasn't by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, but by Hummy Man. Like I said before, the original songs in the movie aren't great, but as for the music itself, good God, it's brilliant. I mean, nothing can top the original music from the TV series, but for a kids' movie, the music is just beautifully done, even if it only has the Thomas theme once, and then does instrumentals of those two boring songs over and over again. My favorite piece is no doubt the instrumental of the TV show theme that plays after the opening credits. It just really captures the spirit of the island of Sodor. I really wish they would have had the main theme as the main theme of the soundtrack rather than Really Useful Engine, but Really Useful Engine works really well too. While the other songs weren't very interesting, the version of Really Useful Engine in this movie is beautiful. Heck, I like listening to the instrumental version of it even better. Hearing it played by an actual orchestra, like when Thomas goes through the Magic Railroad, really captures the spirit of Thomas. I would have liked to have seen Night Train make the final cut. It's one of my favorite Thomas songs, so hearing that by an orchestra would be a massive treat. Speaking of the spirit of Thomas and Sodor, while the human world was pretty dull, Sodor looks so real, realer than it ever has before. From the classic series of the show, Sodor looks very charming, but it's obvious it's a model railway. In Magic Railroad, there's no inanimate people, there's real actors. Even if it was just simple green screen, seeing models interact with real people just fascinates me. While I'm talking about this, I want to bring up an interesting point that the nostalgia critic Roger Ebert and many other people often make. The fact that the faces have no movement. Normally, I would agree with the nostalgia critics saying it's lazy and creepy for a theatrical movie. There are many TV shows, especially British shows from the 80s and 90s, that don't have any mouth movement and the characters suddenly go from one expression to another. Examples of these include the early episodes of Postman Pat and Fireman Sam. For a TV show, you don't have as big of a budget, so it's understandable why you'd want to lessen production by another year. But in a full-length theatrical movie, you generally have a bigger budget and the audience is expecting a lot more effort. Therefore, you have to have the simple act of facial movement. Hell, the Garbage Pail Kids tried to add facial movement, and even that didn't help the fact that it's the worst movie of all time. However, Thomas did really well with no mouth movement in the show. Even without lip syncing, it still captured the character's emotions of the Railway series. And for a train, it actually seems a lot more real that the faces don't move. It's actually very hard to explain why, so I'll try my best. Trains are machines, not living creatures, so seeing a face on a train is obviously not normal to the human eye. But having faces that don't move will appear more realistic on a train. When you see faces on engines, like at Day Out with Thomas, they don't move their face, do they? If they did, it would be really goddamn creepy. In a full CGI world, the facial movements work well because the engines aren't real models. That's the problem I had with Season 12, adding CGI faces to models. CGI like this doesn't go well with real life because it just looks creepy. I'm not saying CGI plus real life shouldn't be used, I mean there's plenty of great examples of that, but here it just doesn't mix, especially if it's on a train. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that having faces be static gives a good balance between model trains and living things. Having them appear too alive makes it creepy, so the absence of facial movement in this movie works well. If the humans were like what they were in the show, then I would understand it'd be creepy. But here, the trains, they don't really need facial movement because they're trains. So, what do I think of Thomas and the Magic Railroad? Well, here's my answer. While unfortunately it is technically a bad movie, it does actually try to entertain the audience. Britt Allcroft and David Mitton put a lot of effort into it. They just made a few mistakes that unfortunately downgraded the movie, like mixing Shining Time with Thomas. It's like making a mistake on an airplane causing it to crash. The film is not lazy like The Last Airbender or the Garbage Pail Kids movie, and it doesn't insult the original source by adding obvious and poor adult humor like The Cat in the Hat. It's not a good movie, even for a kids movie, but it isn't awful either. But looking beyond the flaws, I actually do enjoy Thomas and the Magic Railroad. It was a huge part of my childhood and is definitely one of the movies I will never forget. Even as a kid, I knew there were flaws, but there's also lots of good stuff that kinda makes up for it. If you're not a Thomas fan, I'd say you're probably not gonna like it. But if you are, definitely check it out. There'd be no harm. Like, no fan has seen it. Yeah, but that's another thing. While the film does have a lot of bad stuff, it's never really bad to the point where it's just unwatchable. It never gets so god-awful that you want to puke. If I were to rate the film, I give it 2.5 or 2.6 stars out of 5. It's not great, but it isn't awful either. Thomas and the Magic Railroad definitely does not deserve all the hate it gets. While the Nostalgia Critic brought up some interesting and valid points, his review is just too harsh on it. I mean, it's a kid's film. Heck, he hasn't even seen the show. So, did the movie bring Thomas into a dark hole? Kind of, but not really, I think. Season 6 wasn't great, but it was still enjoyable. Season 7 was much better as far as the stories. Thomas really went down during Season 8, but even Season 8 through 12 weren't that bad. I mean, yeah, the changes were stupid, but the stories, they were okay. Well, some of them at least. Therefore, Thomas and the Magic Railroad is obviously a clunker, but also has a lot of good stuff as well. And this concludes Thomas Juan Edward II Henry III's review of Thomas and the Magic Railroad. Sparkle, sparkle, sparkle! Yes, sparkle, sparkle, sparkle!